In this episode, Florence and Michael interview me about an article in which I use something called deductive block modelling. We decided to explore my use of block modelling, not only because I use this complicated social network analysis method, but also because I use basic measures of association to compare a hypothetical model to a real model. And although measures of association are one of the first things that we learn when we do statistics, it's actually quite hard to find examples of how and where these have been used in the published social science research.
So we're here today with Dr Clare Saunders. She's Associate Professor at the Politics Department at the University of Exeter. And we'll talk about her article on the relationship between contact with environmental organizations and public attitudes and behavior. So just to start, we thought we'd start with a question on a short summary of your study and how you structured your research.
It's actually quite a complex study because it tries to do two things. On the one hand, it's trying to illustrate a fairly novel methodology that I call deductive block modelling. And on the other hand, it's looking for relationships between what people believe about the environment, how they use energy in their homes, and how those two things are related to whether they've had any contact with environmental organisations. One of the things that really motivated me to write it, if I'm completely honest, was a special issue on social networks. And I thought, okay, I've developed this new methodology on using social networks, using this thing called block modelling. How can we apply that to the data that we have on this amazing project? It's an incredibly data-rich project. So this is kind of a side paper away from the main research questions, which were really about how people use energy in their homes and how you can encourage people to use less energy in their homes. But we had some amazing data on the types of what I call encounters people have with environmental organisations. And we've also actually monitored people's electricity use. We've also monitored their gas use, but we've got this huge database which includes loads of detail at 2-second resolution of how people are using electricity in their homes. It was about trying to combine those two things, and I'll explain a bit more because I know you have some questions about why there are only 72 households and so on. We were monitoring energy use in many more homes than that, but we could only focus on the ones where the data was complete. But we thought that was enough to illustrate how the methodology was used, and also to show that the people who tend to share contacts with particular environmental organisations also tend to share particular attitudes, generally greener attitudes if they share membership of several environmental organisations, and they also tend to use less energy in their homes, measured by something called baseload, which I think you're going to ask me a bit about in a while.
So what is it on a more broader scale that motivated you to start looking at the area of social movements?
Oh, I've been looking at social movements ever since I started my career in academia. I did my PhD on environmental movements, did a postdoc on the global justice movement, did a lot of work on Friends of the Earth International, and I've carried on looking at protest ever since. But what motivated this article in particular in terms of the topic, you'll notice the first part of the title is Beyond the Activist Ghetto. So the idea here was to look at how social movements have an effect, environmental social movements in particular, how they have an effect on people who aren't full-on members, because most of the literature on social movements tends to focus, for understandable reasons, on people who are actively involved in movements. And here we wanted to take a step back and look at people who are called checkbook members, so people who are members that don't really do much apart from pay their direct debit, and also to look at people who may have had some other contact without being members. Does just hearing from an environmental organisation change people's attitudes to the environment? Does it change people's energy use in their homes? I know that we're not able to actually answer the question of whether there's any change or what the change is due to because of issues around causality, but we were interested in whether there was a relationship between contact with environmental organisations, attitudes, and how people use energy in their homes amongst kind of broader publics than what's called the activist ghetto, which is where most social movement research lies.
So you said earlier that you came up with this method of research, the block modelling, inductive block modelling. So why was it the right one to choose for this particular article?
Okay, so what we tend to teach undergraduates, I don't actually, because I don't believe it's true, is that you find your research question first, and then you find the method to fit your research question. Actually, I confess, and I'm willing for this to go out to the world, that in this case, I had the method in mind first, before thinking about what the research question would be. This paper was written specifically for a special issue of a journal that was on social movements and social networks. So I have to say that the method came first. However, I did make sure that there was a close relationship between the research questions and the method. So that would be my advice to any student, so long as there's a close relationship between what you're asking and the way you want to ask it, that's absolutely fine. But I will be totally honest in saying that this was a methods-driven research design rather than a research question-driven design. I'm motivated by this method for a number of reasons. People have tried to do what's called block modelling before, and there are various ways of doing it. And I've set on this method of doing it deductively. So you set some hypotheses and then you directly test to see if your data, network data, meets those hypotheses. What people have done in the past is to just run this block modelling using an algorithm. It's called CONCOR, which stands for Convergence of Iterated Correlations. A number of social movement scholars have used this method, and I am not convinced that the results it gives are robust, because I'll explain a bit later about errors, but when you use CONCOR inductively, i.e. you just ask a computer program to find your model, there are lots of errors in it, and those errors don't meet any kind of theoretical assumption. So I wanted to think about doing it the other way, where I would try to get the block model to fit a theoretical assumption, and then to understand the extent to which it doesn't fit those theoretical assumptions.
Can you please explain the hypothetical block model in Table 1 and the process of deductive block modelling?
Okay, again, that's a tricky question, and I think I could probably give almost a whole lecture course on deductive block modelling. But in a nutshell, I'll try to explain what I mean. So you'll see that in Table 1, I talk about people with low electricity use, medium electricity use, and high electricity use. Now remember that in Table 1, they're just in blocks. So actually you wouldn't know that there's lots of individuals within them, medium and high. So we have to imagine there's lots of individuals. Each dot is a person within each of these categories. So in the hypothetical block model, I'm saying that I expect people with low energy use. I expect the network, the block model network there to be complete, which means that I expect everybody with low energy use, more or less, to share with one another at least some contact with environmental organisations. So these are ones in each cell of the matrix, which means when it's complete like that, it's full, every cell has a 1 in it, we just say that that's complete. Now, the people with low electricity use, I expect them to share some encounters with environmental organisations with the people in the medium area, but I don't expect that to be complete. Thus, it's what we call non-null. So there'll be some ones, but also some zeros as well. And then the people with low energy use, we expect them to not share any contact with the people with high energy use, because the people with high energy use don't have encounters with environmental organisations. This is what you would expect theoretically, so we put a load of zeros in the box here. So now if we look back at Table 1 in the paper, basically this is what I mean by complete, this is what I mean by non-null, and this is what I mean by entirely null, and hopefully that makes some sense. So really, there are probably lots of ways of doing block modelling, but in short we could say that there's an inductive way and a deductive way. If you're doing it inductively, you're just giving the social network analysis program your data, and then it orders it into its own blocks that don't necessarily make any theoretical sense. When you do it this way, you're saying, okay, this is what I expect, and to what extent does this kind of thing actually happen in practice, so you can actually test the extent to which it's real. Okay, so I'm going to explain the errors in the matrix. There are 514 errors in the matrix in table 6, and that means that actually 68% of the cells are behaving as we expected, as hypothesised. Now, to just explain what an error means, when an error flags up, it basically means that here we expect this to be complete, i.e. every actor in this block is related to every actor in this block, and here we expect every relationship to be null, i.e. there's lots of zeros. So when there's an error, what's actually happening is that we're getting noughts where we expect there to be ones, and we're getting ones over here where we expect there to be noughts. And that's really just showing us how well the block model fits the actual data.
So in your article you talk about visible cultural artefacts. Can you explain a bit more about what those are, please?
So this relates to, as I was saying, the idea that social movements scholars tend to focus on people in the activist ghetto, so people who are highly involved in social movements. Now, let's say that you were interested in, let's say, the Rastafarian movement. Okay, now I might look like a visible candidate to be part of that movement because I have dreadlocks. I've got red, gold and green on, don't have black skin. But with some movements you can easily tell that people are an adherent of that movement because of the way they look. What we were doing in this article was moving beyond the activist ghetto by looking for things that weren't visible cultural artefacts. So the way people use energy in their homes is hidden, it's behind the back door. You wouldn't necessarily know it without actually conducting some in-depth research on it. So yeah, we were keen to look beyond those visible cultural artefacts in this article.
Okay, you use a database called SQL, and in what ways did that help or hinder your research?
Okay, now it stands for Structured Query Language Database. I didn't set it up, I didn't have anything very much to do with it at all, but the way I understand it is that it's a database that has lots of functionality for somebody like me who doesn't really understand what's going on behind the scenes with lots of code. It's a way in which I could get hold of the data on energy use and be able to interpret and make sense of it myself. So if you imagine our data, we're monitoring people's electricity use in their homes. That's being monitored, so there's a data point every 2 seconds, 2-second resolution. Just imagine how complicated that data set looks. So with the Structured Query Language Database, we're able to simplify that data and make it much more accessible to somebody like me who doesn't necessarily understand all the technical code that goes on behind the scenes.
Okay, can you explain what an affiliation network is, please?
An affiliation network shows how individuals are related by sharing some kind of participation in something. It could be an event, or it could be, in the example of the paper we're using, membership of an environmental organisation. So let me show you with an example of, we start with what's known as a 2-mode network, and then we turn that into the 1-mode network, which is affiliation. So we can take highly successful students like yourselves, so there's Florence and Michael, and we can see if highly successful students are related by sharing an undergraduate experience. So you're both from politics at Penryn. We can add another couple of people, so we could add, say, Ben and add Sue, and they're from the University of somewhere and the University of somewhere else. In a 2-mode network flow, you would have a 1 here because you've done politics at Penryn, and not in these 2 places because you haven't done these 2. Same for Michael here. Ben would have a 0 here, a 1 here, and a 0 there, and Sue would have a 0, a 0, and a 1. We then turn that into what's known as a 1-mode matrix, which would show that, so we'd have the people against the people, Flo, Michael, Ben, and Sue, against Flo, Michael, Ben, and Sue, and obviously you're not related to yourself, but Flo and Michael are related by both having done politics at Penryn. No relationship to these. He's not related to anybody in this network because he hasn't been to the same university as anybody else, and the same course soon. And then we could look at this and say, okay, these two have been the most successful students. Why is that? Well, it could be because they shared an experience of doing their undergraduate degree in politics at Penryn.
For your analysis, you use 72 houses, and why that particular number? It seems a bit.
I can understand why 72 looks like an entirely random number. So in total, during the course of our project, we monitored electricity consumption in 185 houses. That was part of an experimental design, so we had around 85 of those houses in one area and 100 houses in another area that were matched by socio-demographic criteria. The housing stock was deemed similar as well, but what was different was that in one area there was an active local environmental group and in the other area there wasn't, and that's what we were initially interested in comparing. This paper came out of the project at an early stage before we collected the entirety of the data, and what we ended up doing was trying to find a number of houses for which there were no problems with missing data. You have a question further on about using Wi-Fi connections for the electricity metering, which actually was a huge problem because people's Wi-Fi went down and then things need to be reset. So what happened out of the 185 houses in the whole data set, there are a number where we didn't have we selected a particular month. I know you're going to ask me about that as well. For that particular month we needed no missing data, and we only had 72 houses where there was absolutely no missing data. We're dealing with missing data in the bigger project in all sorts of ways. Some very carefully constructed algorithms and so on and so forth that aren't related to this paper.
In a similar vein, is there any particular reason why you chose houses in the southeast? And is it possible that this might have an effect on the generalizability of your research?
Okay, so why the southeast? One of the main reasons for doing it in the southeast was because at the time I was working with colleagues at the University of Southampton, and we were doing surveys in people's houses. We were looking at how they use energy, actually asking them some survey questions face to face. We had to go around and check that they were using the monitoring equipment properly. We had to replace batteries and so on and so forth. So it was largely for logistical reasons that we were in the southeast. We've actually never claimed to be generalisable. We don't necessarily have a generalisable population because we know that both of the areas where we were monitoring people's energy are in the Office for National Statistics area 4A, which represents prospering young households. So, aspiring parents, usually with quite small children, that was our standard population that we were looking at, yeah, so we weren't claiming generalisability.
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, you only used the month of May to conduct your research. Could you have, why in the first place, and could you have used a longer time period to do?
Okay, there are all sorts of reasons for May, and in fact a better way to say it is there are reasons for not including other months. So we wanted to, for energy use, we wanted a sort of typical household time. So we thought school holidays weren't typical because there'd be more occupants in the household. We also thought winter time, not typical either because people use a lot more energy in winter time. So we picked a time, we picked a month for which we had stable data, of which we thought, well, energy use is going to be quite standard at this particular time of the year.
You classify the reception of an email as an encounter. Is there any way of ensuring that these emails are also read?
I think that's a brilliant question, and I think if I had lots of money to do this research again, I would get in touch with the organisation sending emails, so to be able to get in touch with Friends of the Earth and to append a receipt. Did the person actually read it? Even then, you wouldn't know if they were only opening it and not reading it. So it's really tricky. I think in the survey we're saying, have you received an email from Friends of the Earth? I think that, I know what I'm like at managing my own personal email. I receive all sorts of emails from all sorts of places, many of which I don't open. And I know we all interpret questions differently, but I like to think that somebody who ticked a box to say they had received an email from an organisation, that they would actively remember receiving that email, which to me suggests that they probably would have also at least looked at it, if not clearly read it.
So which measures of association did you use in this study, and why did you choose those ones?
We do use a whole host of different measures of association. In one circumstance, I know that we use Fisher's exact test, which is a form of chi-square that you can use on nomial and ordinal variables, but only on a 2x2 contingency table. It's an effective method for working with small sample sizes, which is what we have. We only have 72 households. And then in the data where I'm comparing the actual block model to the hypothetical block model, I was using Kendall's tau, which is good when you're comparing two ordinal variables. And it also gives you a score which indicates how strong the relationship is between two variables. And it always came out as at least modestly strong, the relationship between the hypothetical and the actual block models, and significant as well.
At some point you decide to split the energy use that you find in your data into quartiles. What were the reasons behind it?
Okay, so in order to do a hypothetical block model, I needed categories. It needed to be 3 or 4 categories of households, and in the end I settled for high, low and medium energy use archetypes based on these quartiles. One of the reasons is just simply because that's the type of variable that you need in order to do the deductive block modelling. Why quartiles? We actually put the two quartiles in the middle together, so we had the lowest quartile representing low energy use, the 2 in the middle representing medium energy use, and the one at the top high energy use, so that would really distinguish our high and low users from one another in the best way that we could do at the time with 72 households.
So just to sum up really, if you had the opportunity to do this piece of research again, is there anything you would do differently?
Yeah, I think I would like to have more households. I think it would also be really, really interesting to compare people with different socio-demographics in more detail. Is it the case, for example, an unanswered question is it true that people who are more well off are better placed to make changes to their lifestyles than people who are less well off? How does your income influence even whether you bother to have contact with an environmental organisation in the first place? I think I'd also like to, I'm not quite sure how to do this yet, but we've showed that there's an association between people sharing environmental attitudes and their energy use, and between people sharing contact with environmental organisations and their energy use. But what we don't yet know is what came first. Is it the case that people who are already environmentally friendly and have low energy use join environmental organisations, or is it the case that you join an environmental organisation and then change your behaviour? I don't know that, because one thing that we didn't have in this research design is any sense of the time at which people joined the organisation, what came first and why. So at some point I think it would be really useful to run a similar project again, but to consider the longitudinal element of it and bear in mind that things change over time, to find out when and why people became members of environmental organisations, what came first in the way that they behave as well. One way to do that might be to purposefully select a load of people who aren't members of environmental organisations at all, to monitor their energy use at that time, and then later on to get them all somehow having encounters with environmental organisations, spreading messages about how to save energy use, and to see, well, did that intervention make a difference to their behaviour or not? And that could be a really interesting follow-up experiment.
Just out of interest, do you have any idea which way you think the relationship goes?
I'm really unsure. I think it could easily go either way. I think about myself and I think actually I was trying to be pro-environmental before I was a member of any environmental organisations, because you have to have some sympathy with an organisation to want to join it in the first place. But then it's also the case that many environmental organisations are emerging now that purposefully try to get people to change their energy use in their homes. You know, this is quite a new thing for the environmental movement to be trying to engage in behavioural interventions, so maybe it's a completely different ballgame to how it was 10 years ago when I first signed up to Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. One of the first things we can do is to innovate. By that I mean what we can do is we can use the data that we have to begin to explore research questions that we didn't initially think about. We also learned that there are some interesting issues around sample size. I never really thought that anybody might wonder why, for example, I had 72 households in the sample, and the answer was as simple as that was the number of houses for which we have reliable data. I also think it's useful to distinguish between two types of block modelling: inductive block modelling, which is exploratory, and deductive block modelling, which I find much more useful because you can use it to test hypotheses. One of the reasons why we don't see very many published papers using measures of association is, I think, because they're quite straightforward and they don't always tell us anything about causality. However, I think my use of them in this paper, in this article, shows that measures of association can be quite useful as part of a more complicated research method to show a relationship between two variables. The final really important lesson that we learned from this interview is the difficulty of establishing causation. For example, we have no idea whether people who already save energy in their homes then proceed to join an environmental group, or whether they join an environmental group and then save energy in their homes. And this is something that would require a lot more research in order to find out the true direction of causality.